So in this chapter, we finally get into some actual musicianship skills, and we're going to learn how to count rhythms. Now, you should be doing this already with your instructor, but depending on how your course is progressing, some instructors like to wait until chapter 11 to begin talking about the actual rhythms. So in this chapter, we're going to talk about basic note values, stem direction, because the direction of the stem on particular notes actually has to be a certain way, counting note values, dotted note values, and tuplet notation. Musicians learn to play rhythms by identifying the different notes, rests, and their values. The chart below shows the most commonly used note and rest values. So here you've got a table with various columns. In the first column, you have the name of the symbol. In the second column, you have the symbol for the actual note. This is going to be when the note that you play. The next column where it says rest symbol, that's a symbol for when you shouldn't play. And the final column tells you how many beats to hold these particular symbols. So essentially, in music, you have moments when you are playing and moments when you are being silent. The note symbol indicates that you should play something or sing something, perform something. The rest symbol indicates that you should be silent. So in the first column with the whole notes, you've got the note symbol in that second column. It looks just like a circle with a hollow center. If you see that, you know that you have to hold the note for 4 beats. For the rest symbol, it looks like a top hat with the brim on top, kind of facing down. It'll actually come below the 4th line of the staff system. That indicates you should be silent for 4 beats. Now the half note symbol looks like a whole note, but it has a stem coming up from either the right or down from the left. Now that's important. You can't have a stem coming up from the left or going down on the right. If you're going to have a stem facing up, it needs to go up on the right, as it's shown in the image there. If you want to place it going down for whatever reason, then it needs to be placed on the left. And there's particular reasons why you'll have one on the right or one on the left, which we'll get into later. So the symbol for that is sort of a regular top hat just sitting on the brim, and it will come above the 3rd staff line. So you'll see a little rectangle that comes halfway between the 3rd and 4th staff line, and it comes up. Whereas the whole note, the whole rest, comes down from the 4th staff line and kind of goes about halfway between the 3rd and 4th staff line as well. So that's how you can tell the difference between a whole rest and a half rest. The quarter note symbol looks like a half note, but it's filled in. And again, the stem can either be on the right going up or the left going down. And then you also see the rest symbol for the quarter note. So if you see that symbol, it means you should hold and be silent for exactly 1 beat. As you see, these notes get faster as we go. So the 8th note, it has a flag on it. Otherwise, it looks like a quarter note. This flag indicates that you play it twice as fast as a quarter note. And then you have the 8th note rest symbol. It looks like a line with a little ball coming off it. The ball always goes to the left. So the 8th note, rest or note, is going to be held for half of a beat. So then if you look at the 16th note right below it, you'll notice it's held for a quarter beat. And look at the rest symbol. There's an extra ball on it. So you add 1 ball, and that doubles the speed of the note. Same with the note symbol. With a note symbol, you add an extra flag. So every time you add a flag, you double the note value. So for the 32nd note, it's going to be worth 1/8 of a beat. So you could play 8 32nd notes in the span of 1 quarter note. And it's written with 3 flags coming off the right or 3 balls going to the left. So if you need to, go ahead and take a screenshot of this, but this is also available in your textbook. Give you just a second to review these. Okay, so now I'm going to talk a little more in detail about all these note values. Again, this chart is also in your textbook, so refer to the textbook if you have any confusion. In fact, you should open up to this image in the textbook while I'm talking about these basic note values. So now we're going to differentiate between basic and complex note values. Basic note values are the most commonly used note values in a musical work. When we're talking about very basic chorale style music and simpler music, they are the note values that consist of one or more beats when using a standard time signature. So if you go back to your chart here, there are only 3 notes on here and rests that are considered basic. That's the whole note, the half note, and the quarter note, because they are all worth 1 beat or more. Anything that goes faster than the beat, like the 8th, the 16th, or the 32nd, is going to be considered a complex note value. So time signatures are going to be discussed later, but for now, just understand that basic note values consist of 1, 2, or 4 beats in general. And I have to be very careful about saying in general, because these basic note values that consist of 1, 2, or 4 beats, they can actually change depending on the time signature. You might have a whole note that's suddenly worth only 2 beats, or a half note that's worth 1 beat, or a whole note that's worth 8 beats. So it depends on the time signature, but we'll get into that later. So when it comes to whole notes and rests, beginning musicians, and we're going to approach this from a beginning musician standpoint, they learn that whole notes and rests are held for a full 4 beats. There are situations where a whole note or rest may be held for less or more than 4 beats, but as I said, this is addressed after learning about time signatures. So for now, just know that the whole note is held for 4 beats and the whole rest is also held for 4 beats. So the whole note has a hole in the center and no stem attached to the note head. It's placed immediately after the bar line in most cases. If you have a 4/4 time signature, you don't usually put the whole note in the center of the bar. You put it right where beat 1 falls, because you want to indicate that it's held for the entire measure. The whole rest, on the other hand, is placed in the center of the measure, so that's a little confusing. But the whole rest looks like a rectangular box that hangs from the 4th staff line midway to the 3rd staff line. It is usually centered in the measure. So if we go back to this note image here, this chart, you'll see how the whole rest kind of looks like a top hat. Well, what that line on top is indicating is basically, you can think of it as a ledger line. It's indicating that the whole rest falls below the line. So that's just kind of a ledger line that is used to show you the position of the whole or the half note on the staff. Because the whole note comes below, the half note goes above. And here is another explanation of that. When no staff system is used, the whole note is indicated with a small line, which we call a ledger line. Okay, so stem direction. Any note value that is faster than a whole note will be written with a stem. So if you see a stem, you know immediately that the note is faster than a whole note. And from there, it's just a matter of determining how fast. The direction of the stem will depend largely on the context of the music. If most of the notes occur on or above the 3rd staff line, the stem is written to the left of the note head and facing down. If most of the notes occur below the 3rd staff line, the stem is usually written facing up and to the right of the note head. The decision to place the stem up or down can be a matter of debate amongst engravers, but in general, the stem direction should follow the flow of the music and the general pitch of the notes in question. So you see in measure 1 that B, it goes down, because the majority of the notes will have stems facing down. So it just looks cleaner to have the B go down with a stem going down on the left. In the 3rd measure, you'll see it comes up on the right-hand side of the note. So this is because you're linking the 4/8 notes with a single bar on top. And one thing you're going to find is that there are 2 ways to write 8th notes. You can either write them individually with flags, or you can put a single bar above them. If you had 2 bars, it'd be a 16th note. If you have 3 bars, it'd be a 32nd note. So this bar that you see connecting those 4 notes indicate what you're seeing is an 8th note, because there is only 1 bar. So that's important to understand, that you can write 8th notes in more than one way. And the reason for using the bar here is that it more clearly shows where beat 1 and beat 3 falls. And that can just make it easier to read music. So in general, you want to follow the guidelines for how the music is flowing. If the majority of the notes are going up and using stems that face down, then you might want to make the choice to have all the notes under a beam face down, even if traditionally they might face up. So half notes and rests. The half note or rest is held for 2 beats or half the value of the whole note. So now you're starting to understand where we get these names from. A half note is half the value of a whole note. A quarter note is a quarter of the value of a whole note. So half notes have stems attached to them to differentiate themselves from the whole note. The half note rest occurs during the first or second half of the measure. It depends on whether you want the rest in the first half or the second half, on beat 1 and 2 or 3 and 4. It is not placed in the center of the measure. In a time signature with only 2 beats per measure, half note rests are not used. Instead, whole note rests are used to indicate that the musician should rest for the whole measure. So just know that if you have a 2/4 time signature, you won't use a half rest, you'll use a whole rest if you're going to indicate that the entire measure, the musician should remain silent. And while that may sound confusing, when you're reading music, it should be pretty clear that you're just resting for the whole measure. And then if you're using the proper time signature, you just know that you're resting for 2 beats. So comparing the half and the whole rest, just to make sure you understand this. The whole rest is placed in the center of the measure, and it hangs down from the 4th line midway to the 3rd line. Notice that the half rest begins on the 3rd line and comes up midway to the 4th line. The half rest is placed at the beginning of the measure, or where the rest falls in the measure. In the example, the second half rest falls on the 3rd beat, so it occurs on the second half of the measure. If the half rest occurred on the 2nd beat, it would be placed closer to the beginning of the measure, and it'd probably be a little more towards the middle. You'd want to put it approximately where the 2nd beat of the measure would occur if you had quarter rests the entire time. So you place your rests generally, with the exception of the whole rest, where they would occur in the timeline if you had 4 beats per measure marked out for you. So the quarter note and rest. The note head of the quarter note is filled in, and it has a stem that comes off the side of the note. As with the half note, the stem extends upward from the right or downward from the left, depending on the context in which it's placed on the staff. The quarter note rest requires some practice to learn to draw, but it is proportionally placed in the center of the staff system. So you just kind of go down to the right, and then a swipe to the left, down to the right, and then curve around in sort of a half circle to the left, ending to the right. It's something that if you want to learn to draw, you should probably print a copy of it and just trace a quarter note rest until you got it down. So when counting basic notes, you'll place a number under each note in the measure to indicate where the note falls in relation to the beat. So in a 4/4 time signature, we have 4 beats. So the numbers 1, 2, 3, and 4 should be used. After the bar line, the numbering starts over again at 1. So the bar line always resets our counting. It's important to know how many beats each note is worth to be able to determine where to place each note in the measure. So in the first example, you have 1, 2, 3, 4, and then you have 2 half notes, which are each worth 2 beats. So you'd hold those for 1, 2. Second half note would be 3, 4. And then your whole note would be held for 4 beats. So if you were to now clap this while counting out loud, you'd be able to play this rhythm, and it would sound like this. 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. So you're holding the note values based on the beat. So the beat helps you figure out how to play a rhythm. And once you learn a rhythm, you don't really have to count so much. You can just feel it with the pulse of the music. But when initially learning how a rhythm is performed, it's good to put these beats underneath so you can figure out what the rhythm sounds like. Rests are numbered the same way. They are seen in a score but never heard in a performance because they represent silence. So if I were to clap the second example, I would just say 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. I wouldn't clap at all because I'm just resting the entire time. Now that we've talked about basic note values, we're going to be talking about complex notes and rests. So any notes and rests that are played faster than the beat are known as complex notes and rests. Complex note values typically divide note values into two smaller subdivisions per beat, but they may even divide into 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, or even smaller subdivisions. The most common complex note values and rests are the 8th and the 16th note. Although in certain slower pieces you may actually see a 32nd and a 64th note. Now I say slower pieces because often if you see a 32nd or a 64th note or even a 128th note, the piece isn't going to be going that fast because not many performers can actually perform a 32nd note at a really fast tempo. So that generally indicates, if you have note values like that the music is at a slower tempo in general. So now we're going to talk about 8th notes and rests. The 8th note and the 8th rest are typically held for a half beat, but this value may change depending on the time signature used. You'll understand this more once we talk about time signatures and simple and compound meters. But for now, assume that all the 8th notes are worth 1/2 of a beat. So the term 8th note or rest comes from the fact that the note is worth 1/8 the value of a whole note. That means you can fit 8 eighth notes in the span of one whole note. So when counting 8th notes and rests, the musician typically recites 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and. Now you'll notice I said and instead of plus. That plus symbol is used to indicate the word and, but it's not pronounced as plus. So that's an important thing that you should understand. And using these subdivisions, by putting the and on every other beat, we're able to count note values that are actually less than the simple beat. So numbers indicate the placement of the beat. The plus sign represents the 8th notes that don't fall on the beat and is pronounced and. So if you look at this second example here, the second image, where you see 1 plus 2 plus 3 plus 4 plus, you should actually pronounce that 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and. And you keep a steady tempo. So you don't want to say 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and. You want to keep it very steady. And that allows you to count note values that are smaller than the beat. So if I were to perform this, I might start by counting off one measure. We might call that one measure for nothing, and then playing the actual example. So 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and. So by using subdivisions, I was able to just figure out what that rhythm was and learn what it sounds like. And as I get better, then I can actually get rid of the subdivision counting and just clap the rhythm based on rote memorization. So here's an example. But counting the subdivisions is very useful when you're first starting out because it helps you to ensure that you are playing the correct rhythm. The 8th note and the 8th note rest are typically going to be held for half a beat, but it's important to keep in mind that at a future date you're going to find out how this value can change depending on the time signature that's used. The time signature not only tells us how many beats are in a measure, but it tells us how long to hold each beat for. So in certain time signatures, a quarter note might not be worth one beat, it might be worth 2 beats or even half a beat. But for now, just assume that any 8th note or any 8th note rest that you see is worth half of a beat. The term 8th note itself comes from the fact that the note is worth 1/8 the value of a whole note. That means you can fit 8 8th notes in the span of one whole note. And again, just to reiterate, when counting 8th notes and rests, the musician typically recites 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and that will go for rests or beats. And you would only perform when there's an actual note to perform. So in the second example here, in the second image, you'd only perform every time there's an actual note. So you would be silent during the rest periods. You can beam eighth notes a couple different ways. We basically either use beams or flags. If you use a flag, that's how you identify an eighth note all by itself when it's not connected to another eighth note. When you use a beam, as you see in the second measure, that can be useful to help show where the beat falls. So take a look at the second measure where you have this series of eighth notes that are grouped into pairs of 2. That clearly shows where beat 1, 2, 3, and 4 falls, because the beam is broken before each beat. That's also a common way to write eighth notes. In the third measure, there's another way to write eighth notes, where you beam 4 of them into groups of 4. And this is going to be more common if the piece is really fast, or it has more of a 2 feel than a 4 feel. So instead of 1, 2, 3, 4, it might have more of a pulse like 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. So it just depends on the music, but these are just a few different ways in which you can use beams. You can use them by themselves, where you group them into pairs of 2. You can group into pairs of 4, or you can have them isolated where you just have the stem coming off each eighth note. The way that you beam notes may also have an effect on how a piece is performed. You see in the first example there are no beams, it's just eighth notes with flags attached to them. That is often useful when the composer wants to indicate that there's a separation between each eighth note. So each eighth note would be played short. So dot 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 instead of da 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 da. You notice how the second example I connected the eighth notes. In the first one I played them very short and accented almost. In the second option, that's usually going to be used when they are broken down into beats. So here we can see beat 1, 2, 3, and 4. And in the third measure, that's often going to help show where the accent in a piece should be. So if you look at the second measure, you would accent the first eighth note in each pair. So you'd have bum 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 bum. The first one being played just a little bit harder than the second one. Same thing with measure 3, except we only accent the first and the third beat. So bum 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 bum. So the way that you beam things can have an implication on how it's going to be performed. If you beam something into groups of 4, the performer is naturally going to want to play that first beat just a little bit heavier than the second, third, and fourth offbeats. The next note value you need to know about is the 16th note and the 16th rest. These are typically held for 1/4 of a beat, but the exact value requires knowledge of the time signature of the section, so that's something you'll learn about later. For now, just know that a 16th note, there's going to be 16 of them in a whole note, and they're typically held for 1/4 of a beat. When you're counting 16th notes, the musician will mark their music with 1 E and A, 2 E and A, 3 E and A, 4 E and A. You can see that in the example below. So what this means is anytime you have a 16th note that comes right after the beat, you'll use the E symbol. If it comes in the middle of the beat, where the quarter note would fall, then you use a plus sign. So you use the word and. If it falls on the very end of the beat, if it's the last 16th note of the beat, then it's a. So now I can play this rhythm by counting 1 E and a, 2 E and a, 3 E and a, 4 E and a, and keeping that tempo really steady, and then just clapping every time I see a note. So here's an example. I'll give you one measure where I won't play anything, and then I will tap the rhythm that's shown in the middle example. 1 E and a 2 E and a 3 E and a 4 E and a 1 E and a 2 E and a 3 E and a 4 E and a. So if there were rests, I simply wouldn't play during the rests. So you see the 16th note on the left-hand side, the first image. That's what a 16th note looks like when it's not beamed. You just use 2 flags. So for every flag that you add to a note, it doubles the value. It makes it twice as fast. So an 8th note had only 1 flag and it was worth half a beat. A 16th note has 2 flags, so it's worth a quarter of the beat, or half an 8th note. If you look at the last image, that's what a 16th note rest looks like. If you remember the 8th note rest, it only had 1 little ball coming off the side of it. This one has 2. Because there are 2 balls, that means it's twice as fast as an 8th note rest. And you'd have 16 of these in a single measure, or in the span of a whole note. Sixteenth note beaming follows the same principles as 8th note beaming. In the first measure, the 16th notes are shown without a beam. It indicates a slight separation between the notes. In the second measure, this is a very uncommon way of beaming 16th notes, but this would show half the beat, and it might be useful for a composer who really wants to accent the first part of the beat and the middle of the beat. But it would probably never actually be done unless the time signature warrants a division of the beat like this. The third measure is the most common method to write 16th notes, since it clearly shows where the beat falls in the music. It would be very unusual to beam 16th notes into groups of 8. Generally, you're going to see 16th notes beamed as you will in the third measure. As a side note, in that first measure, the only time you're really going to see 16th notes beamed or not beamed, where they're not connected with a beam and you just see them individually with the flags, is in vocal music. A lot of times in vocal music, it's a convention to not beam individual notes as they relate to the lyrics. But that's kind of a more advanced topic. Just know that a lot of vocal music will use non-beamed 16th and 8th notes. There's also some additional note values you should just be aware of. Notes that are intended to be played faster than the 16th note can be created by adding a flag to a note or an extra ball to a rest. So if you look at the first image, you start with an 8th note, then you have a note that is twice as fast, the 16th note, and then that number 16, you just double it to get the third image, which is a 32nd note. It has 3 flags, and then you add another flag, and you make the note value twice as fast again, and you get a 64th note. So you can keep going. You can go to 128, 256, it doesn't matter. You can keep adding as many flags as you need to get the note value you want. The same thing applies to the rest on the other side in the second image. Rest, you just keep adding another ball until you have the rest value that you need. So you notice the 8th rest. It starts with a ball in the third space, and then it adds a ball below for the 16th note rest, and then you add a ball above for the 32nd note rest, and then below for the 64th note rest. If you have a 128th rest, you'd add another ball above the staff on that first space, and it just keeps alternating between adding a ball above and below. So just to make sure this is clear, you could play 2 16th notes in the span of 1 8th note. 2 32nd notes can be played in the span of 1 16th note, or you could play 4 of those in the span of 1 8th note. And 2 64th notes can be played in the span of 1 32nd note, or you could play 4 within the span of 1 16th, or 8 within the span of 1 8th note. It just comes down to divisions. There's one addition you can make to a note value to change how much it's worth. This is where we're going to talk about the dotted note value. So if you look at the first image, you'll see a half note with a dot next to it. That is actually worth the equivalent of a half note tied over to a quarter note. So that half note with a dot is worth 3 beats. In the other example, you see a quarter note with a dot. So that means it's going to be equal to a quarter with an eighth note attached to it. So it's worth 1.5 beats. And then finally, you have an eighth note with a dot attached to it. So that's equal to an eighth note plus a 16th note. An eighth note plus a 16th note is going to be worth 3 16th notes. So that example is worth 3/4 of a beat. So the dotted note value does make rhythms a little bit more complex, but basically what's happening is instead of using a tie to connect two notes of different values, a dot can be used instead. So a single dot increases the value of a note by half. So if you have a half note, that's worth 2 beats. If you cut that in half, that's 1 beat. So you take 2 plus 1, so you get 3 beats for the dotted half note. With a quarter note, that's worth 1 beat. Half of the beat, if you take that and divide it in half, is half. So you add the original quarter note value to half a beat, you get 1.5 beats. So that's how the dot can change the note value. You might also come across a double dot. Now what this does is it increases the value of the note by half of the original value plus half the value of the added note. So in the first example, you have a double dotted half note. So that means you take the half note, you cut it in half, you get a quarter note, so you add that quarter note to the value of the half note, so we're at 3 beats now. Now you cut the value of the quarter note in half, and you get an eighth note. So in all, a double dotted half note is going to be worth 3.5 beats. You could even have a triple dotted half note, and that would just continue to increase the value of the half note by half of the previous note's value and add it to the end. So with 3 dots, there's a half note, plus a quarter note, plus an eighth note, plus a 16th note. So that's going to be held for almost the entire measure. You'll just cut off on the very last 16th note. So there'll be a brief separation between the last note and the next measure. So go ahead and take a look at this first example and try and clap it on your own. I'm going to mentally clap through this in my head, and once I'm finished, I'm going to clap it with you. So I'll give you one measure, and then you should come in after the 4th beat. So 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 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 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and. Okay, if you missed it, let's try it again. I'm going to give you one measure, and then you're going to come in after I count off the first measure. I'll say 1, 2, ready, and go, and then you will come in on beat 1. So here's an example. 1, 2, ready, and go, and 1, and 2, and 3, and 4, and 1. Okay? So now try clapping this along with me. I'll give you one measure, and then you're in on the second measure. 1, 2, 3, and go now. 1, and 2, and 3, and 4, and 1, and 2, and 3, and 4, and 1, and 2, and 3, and 4, and 1, and 2, and 3, and 4, and. Okay, let's try the second example. The line right below that. I'll give you 4 beats, and I'm not going to clap the rhythm the first time, but I will clap it the second time so that you can see if you can do this on your own. 1, 2, 3, and go, and 1, and 2, and 3, and 4, 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 and. So this time, I'm going to clap this with you, and I'm going to say the note values out loud. But I'm going to leave off the and when there isn't an and to perform. If there isn't an eighth note on the second half of the beat, then I'm just not going to say and. That's a common way to count rhythms, but often students that are just learning should probably go with the first option, where you just continually subdivide every single beat throughout the entire piece. So here's this second example. 1, 2, ready, go. 1, 2, and 3, 4, and 1, and 2, and 3, 4, 1, 2, and 3, 4, 1, and 2, and 3, 4. So you'll notice I only clapped when there was a beat or when there was an actual note value to perform. The final thing we need to talk about is tuplet notation. So a tuplet is a term used to describe a set of notes that are usually placed over or under a bracket to change the note value in a pretty unusual way. They subdivide the beat typically into groups of 3 evenly spaced notes. So in the example below, we have 3 measures. The first measure, you have eighth note triplets, what we call them, because there's 3 tuplets in there. In the second measure, we have quarter note triplets because there are 3 tuplets. In measure 3, we have half note triplets because there are 3 half note tuplets. So those terms are very similar, tuplet and triplet. A tuplet just refers to the concept of grouping more than 2 notes in a bracket to create an unusual division of the beat. The triplet means that there are 3 of them in a tuplet. So in the first measure, since an eighth note is worth half a beat and twice the value of an eighth note is a quarter note, the tuplet must be broken into 3 equal parts over the duration of 1 beat. So if I were to play the first measure, first you need to understand that those triplets, the triplet eighth notes, have to be played in the span of 1 beat. So here's 1 measure as a count off, and then I'll play the triplet. 1, 2, 3, 4, triplet. So that's often something that people will say when counting triplets. Triplet, triplet. It allows you to conceptualize the uneven spacing. And it's not even that it's uneven. Each individual triplet is going to be held for the same amount of time, but it's not equally dividing the beat. So if you take a look at the second measure, you have quarter note triplets. So all 3 of them together are called a tuplet. They would take up the space of 2 beats. Because 2 quarter notes would be worth 2 beats. You add that third triplet, and it means you have to play 3 over the course of 2 beats, which makes it a little bit harder to conceptualize. In the final example, in the final measure, because you have 3 half notes under a tuplet sign, it means that you have to hold those over the span of 4 beats. So that would take up the entire measure. So you'd have 3 equally spaced notes played over the course of 4 beats.